Hi, good evening. This is Gene from Listening in Radio, KB9001 MWDX, KB9001 SWL, and KB9001 SSB, and of course my ham radio call sign WN9ZWC. I've had a couple of concerned parents ask me some questions over the last few months, and the question pertained to communications with family members who were either living abroad or living in another state, maybe having kids going to college, or their children living away from home, and they're very concerned about things that are going on right now. And rightfully, everybody should be concerned about what's going on because there is a lot going on in the world. Well, their question pertained to communications, and they asked me why. Well, I'm a ham radio operator, and I do this program, and I own a lot of radio equipment, both receivers and transceivers and many other things. And so they came to me asking questions. And so I'm making this video to address that, and how do things work during a real emergency, and what happens with communications, and what are the alternatives for communications, because it may be limited. So it's going to take some thought process in an emergency to figure out how we're going to pull things back together, how we're going to get communications across as certain systems are down, and how we're going to respond to that. So I'm going to address that in this video today. And the first thing that I want to discuss are real-life emergencies and how real-life emergencies affect us. And what are real-life emergencies? And I'm sure we see it every day coming over our phone and coming over the TV and over the internet. And real-life emergencies that we deal with on a daily basis or a semi-regular basis are things like tornadoes, hurricanes during hurricane season, wildfires, like the derecho we had here several years ago, which knocked our power out for 7 days straight. So those type of things. We are certainly fairly prepared to deal with such incidents, and the professionals that are paid to handle that, and some of the volunteer level people say within the ham radio community. But I'll talk at that a little bit too about what's changed over the years. They tend to address that, but I'm beginning to see that a lot of the emergency response from the volunteer level has eroded over the years. And I have to take you back to post World War II and the end of World War II, and actually probably during World War II, to an organization called Civil Defense. And that organization pretty much existed up until probably the middle of the Cold Wars, when it started to fade off. In fact, another organization morphed out of the Civil Defense organization. It was called Civil Air Patrol. And I'm sure I bet you a lot of my listeners out there either were in Civil Air Patrol. I was in Civil Air Patrol, and as an adult too, I was in Civil Air Patrol, and I was in the military as well. So I did some volunteer service there, and I was also with the Coast Guard Auxiliary when I was living in Illinois, because I was very close to the Great Lakes area, and they needed help, so I actually volunteered with the Coast Guard Auxiliary too. But these organizations over time have eroded, and the civilian participation in the emergency management process has just about been erased. And I know that because my last hitch involved with that type of volunteerism was with the Civil Air Patrol, and the Civil Air Patrol was, let's say, marginalized by emergency services and by public safety and city public safety and state level public safety organizations and local fire departments. They were kind of sidelined, as was the entire civil defense program eventually, and the emergency response responsibility ended up falling to basically two entities over the last 25 years, maybe longer than that. And that responsibility was handed over to some organizations such as MARS, which is the Military Amateur Radio Service, and that is now defunct and gone as far as I know. I don't believe they exist anymore. And it was handed over to regular police, fire, state, civilian services to oversee the emergency management process. And also ham radio operators became heavily involved with RACES, which is a Radio Amateur Emergency Services, and ARES, which again is another amateur radio emergency services organization. And RACES and ARES are basically the same thing, and they mixed up, and they were meshed together in several instances. And I've seen better examples than what I'm seeing now. They're not really active, especially the county I'm in. They're not active. There is an ARES organization, but their involvement is what I'd classify as minimal. And I think it's gotten a little bit better over the last, I don't know, couple months or so, because they finally implemented a net control. But those ham radio operators are not connected to any public safety organizations. Everything has gone digital and everything has gone on the internet. But what's happened with that, it's created a situation where the public safety response and the emergency response has fallen to very few people, and it's really fallen to the paid people and the paid public safety people to handle. And of course, they're overwhelmed. But the civilian element in the volunteerism for public safety and emergency services is completely eroded at this point. So with that said, where do you turn to in the event of an emergency and you need emergency communications? Well, I have to kind of go back to the beginning. I'll start where we're at now, but I need to go back. We'll take you back to the beginning of how communications were disseminated, going back to even, my time. At this point, communications is disseminated to each individual citizen by what? The cell phone. The cell phone is the most predominant, though controlled, piece of electronic equipment we've ever had. More controlled than ham radio, more controlled than Citizens Band, and Citizens Band is something I'll talk about as we progress through this as well. So cell phones, are landlines still around? Some houses probably still have landlines. I don't know of many. I do not have a landline anymore, and I have to imagine with the cost of cell phones that perhaps a lot of 21st century younger people have divested their landlines. It is an ancient technology. Television is another way to communicate, but it's a one-way communication. It is not a two-way communication. Of course, and the question I was trying to address is, well, what happens when we get separated from our loved ones? What do we do? How do we approach this? The technologies are not as easy to grasp and understand as one might think, and there's a lot of misconceptions about the use of ham radio. Remember, if you want to do ham radio, you must pass a test, and you must be licensed to get a ham radio, and that call sign belongs to the Federal Communications Commission's here issued call sign, but technically it belongs to them. Can you disseminate emergency traffic on a radio? Yes, you can. In fact, the rule is if you have any radio whatsoever, any radio, if you're in a dire emergency, you can use that radio for emergency traffic, and that's fine. Now, with that said, though, understanding what radio applies to what, I'll give you a pretty good example. There was a big flap of these Chinese knockoff radios called Biofang radios that came in. They're, as far as I'm concerned, they're not a good product. And these people are buying them up thinking that they will provide some sort of communications. Well, sure, they'll provide short-range communications at any family radio service or GMRS radio, because it's in that same range. It's line of sight. It's only going to go so far. You're not going to be able to talk across state on it unless you have a ham radio license and you can get into a linked repeater system. And then, you might be able to get out. There are linked repeater systems in different parts of the country. I used to get on one up north on the Great Lakes where I could key into a radio in Manitowoc, Wisconsin, and talk to somebody up in Lansing, Michigan, and in Indiana. So it was a good system, but you had to have a ham radio license and you had to have the right radio, the correct radio, not just a Biofang radio handheld. You probably needed a mobile radio with 55 to 100 watts behind it to get into these systems. It's just not that easy. It's very hit and miss. So I think a lot of people think that these are magical radios, and they have a little keyboard on them that looks like a DTMF pad from your phone. It doesn't work that way. That DTMF pad is functional for the radio, and back in the old days, a DTMF pad actually acted as a code pad where you could key the radio, key into a repeater, and open up what we call the phone patch, because ham radio repeaters used to have phone patches on them. I don't know of any ham radio repeaters that have a phone patch on them anymore. There's no need to, because we have cell phones. So what's the worst case scenario? We deal with weather, we deal with hurricanes, we deal with incidents on the ground. What is the worst case scenario? What if, and the question is, I think the fear that the people who are talking to me have is the fear is that we are going to have a full-blown conflict, and people are afraid of getting cut off from their families if the proverbial shit hits the fan. Am I worried about that too? Minimally. I am worried. I am worried about that. I'm not really worried about communications. I have a way to set up communications for myself where I may be able to get hold of somebody. And may I add that during this time, if something like that ever did occur, your best bet would be to have a shortwave AM, FM radio because, say, for instance, if you don't have internet, you're not going to get internet radio. If you have Sirius XM, well, Sirius XM is fine, but like Sirius XM, it's all music, news, and entertainment. You don't get much over it. Yeah, and nothing useful, nothing locally. It would be very useful if you had an AM radio and you can listen to your local AM radio stations, which is why we keep saying that we need to keep AM radios in vehicle because they're crucial to the emergency communication system. So we get our localized weather and any disasters that might happen coming through the local radio stations, which we're not going to get through Sirius XM. These are just things that most people don't understand. So let's talk about worst case scenario. What is the worst case scenario? The worst case scenario would be a conflict, which could happen, which God forbid, God forbid. If a conflict occurred, the first thing that would go down in a real conflict, and I'm talking about a major conflict, would be all of our communications instruments and infrastructure and electricity and services would be taken out. That is the first act in any pre-planning for an attack. That is the first consideration, is to deprive the people on the ground of what's useful to them, which would be electricity, lights during nighttime, things like that. That would be the first thing that would happen. So what does that do to communications? Well, certainly cell phone towers will be down. Landlines will be down. Cable TV will be down. So these are things that are still on a cable, a wire. Even 5G is on a cable somewhere along the line. Even my TV, which is not wireless, but it's cable, fiber optic. I have fiber optic. Excuse me, I had to think about that. But I have the fiber optic. If fiber optic is cut, you don't have it. It's gone. The infrastructure is knocked out. You are not going to have that. If your fiber optic comes in and say you have a Roku and that's your TV and that's what you've been working with, your Roku will not have internet. It will not work. It will absolutely not work. Those things will be lost. Maybe it won't be widespread. Could it be localized? Yes. Could it be widespread? Yes. It could be widespread. But these are considerations that we have to think about. So in the military, before we were getting deployed and we were going on a mission, and a lot of military, when I say this, you'll understand what I'm saying. There's 3 phases to, say, being deployed on a mission, and it goes something like this. It goes warno, op-ord, frago. So a warno is a warning that you get before something's going to happen. They come down and say, get ready, we're getting ready to do something. Be prepared, get your equipment in line. We're going to be going. That's the warno. Simple, right? Then you get your operational order, you get your op-ord, right? And then when you set foot in another country or you set foot in battle space, you end up in what they call frago territory. Well, what's frago? Frago are fragmented orders. So as civilians, we live in frago territory. We are not going to get a warno. We are not going to get an op-ord. We will not know what's going on that side of the fence because we're not privileged to it. It's a secret, or top secret, or ultra top secret, whatever it may be. So we're not going to be privileged to that. We live in frago territory. We're always getting surprises. Every single day we get a surprise when we wake up on the cell phone and go to X. We get a surprise. There's all kinds of fragos going on. We're just fragoed to death, right? But that's the way it has to work for us. So you have to be prepared to live, breathe, and eat in frago territory, which means you need to be prepared to deal with whatever the consequences of that are. Now, my best advice to one person who asked me, so she said, well, what do I do? My child is living all the way in another part of the state. I just need to have a quick communication. The thing that might remain up, it might remain operational, but it's still no guarantee, would be a satellite phone. Sat phones, in fact, I've worked for, well, I'll say security operations. I won't say any more than that. I work for security operations where in our repertoire of equipment, we had sat phones. And those sat phones were important because we could either end up in somewhere that was very remote, or our communications could be knocked out for some reason, or we had to bug out because we got hit by a problem in the Frago territory and we had to take that with us, so we had to be able to have communication. So satellite, to me, knowing what the experts do, because they have these sat phones in their repertoire, that's probably a pretty good indication as to what the best mode of communication is. Then there's ham radio. Well, ham radio, been doing it for almost 25 years. I will tell you, from my experience, it's hit and miss. Then there's VHF, UHF radios, such as the FRS service, which you can look up. I won't give you all the real details on the law on that, but you can buy what they call bubble packaged radios, and they're usually family radio service, and you can use those. They're very close range, though. If you get into a great position, you can get a stretch of 5+ miles out of an FRS radio. But all VHF, UHF communications, which the FRS radios are up in the UHF spectrum, it's going to be line of sight. So like in the old days when we would have to get to the top of a hill to get that radio signal out, well, the tallest antenna wins. And that's how UHF and VHF communications works. Then you can possibly, if you're a ham operator, for us we would use HF. But I'm going to touch on this real quick. Citizens band radios. Citizens band radios are plentiful. They're all over. They are in almost every truck that I see on the road still today. They're still sold in truck stops. They're available online. Many people have them, and I have a feeling that if the shit really did hit the fan, that those Citizens band radios, and I have a Citizens band radio, but it has single sideband capability, we would be on the radio probably talking to each other then, or being a ham radio operator, we would be up on HF talking to each other. I wouldn't feel 100% comfortable being on the HF bands and talking anything except pleasure and fun on the ham radio, unless there's some emergency communications going on HF. I'm not hearing too much of that anymore. The last time I did hear about HF communications being involved with certain disasters that were being, I think they were being controlled by the different Red Cross emergency services, and they were using ham radio during 9/11. So they were being used at one time, and the Coast Guard Auxiliary had their own net, but it was more for fellowship. It wasn't for emergency communications. In fact, the government has come down quite hard on that sort of thing. There was an operation a few years ago during the Iraq War and what was in Afghanistan War, where there was a ham radio outfit that was trying to set up a communications center where communications could be routed from soldier, sailor, and airmen back to the U.S. to their families, and the government was very quick to come in and shut that down. I could get more details on that, but I remember it starting to take form, and then it was poo-pooed by the Pentagon because they didn't want that happening. So they're going to control that aspect. But again, Citizens band radios might be a viable way. So it might be our best way because you could run a 12-volt CB off a car battery. You could put it in your vehicle. You have gas in your vehicle. You could run it that way, or you could put a solar panel on a 12-volt battery and charge a 12-volt battery on a solar panel and have communications. I think, I'll be very honest with you, I think that that's a very viable option for emergency communications, and it's very mobile. You can take it along, put it in your vehicle, or have it in your house. Either way, I see it that way, and I've seen it work that way. And there have been times when I picked up the mic on the CB on sideband, of course, and talked to people overseas. Technically, I guess you're not supposed to do that, but unfortunately, skip happens every day. Skip does happen. I talk to people in other states all the time, so it is possible to where if you were diligent enough and patient enough where you could get a message through on a Citizens band. But of course, if your relative doesn't have a Citizens band radio, how are you going to communicate with them? So we're back to the sat phone. Okay, I'm going to try and wrap this up because I don't want this video to be too long. I don't want to bore people to death, but I just wanted to get some information out there to explain to people how this could work. So let's go to the worst case scenario. We have a limited number of CBs. Our communications has been knocked out. So how do we talk to each other in the old days before CBs? Of course, when I was born, radio was kind of new. I mean, the broadcast radio aspect had been around for a long time, and ham radio probably started in the very early part of the 20th century. So those forms of two-way communications have been around. And of course, the two-way radio communications were around in World War II. The first handy-talkies, or the walkie-talkie, as they call it, was born out of the military, and they were the big handheld PRC ones, and they had the man packs that they put on with the big antennas, which the military I think still uses to some extent. There were still some in the guard units when I was still in the National Guard. So there's that type of stuff is still out there. But what happens when it fails? Well, where are we going? Where are we going with that? How is that going to play out? Well, the way we did it in the old way, so if you didn't have a two-way radio, if you didn't have a telephone, well, you wrote a letter. I know it sounds a little bit passé, doesn't it? Writing a letter. Well, who carries letters? Well, runners carry letters. How would we communicate in that situation? Could we have a neighborhood guy on a bicycle who's a runner? We could. That's definitely an option. What about the mailman? Is he a runner? Sure. Could we have other services? Do we have other delivery services who could run? Yes. Could they run supplies? Yes, they can run supplies. Could we do that on our own? Yes, we could provide communication services and being a runner. So I'm just getting back to, I'm hearkening back to the Pony Express days when there was no other way to get a letter or communication through unless somebody got on a horse, or like during World War II, they had communication people who rode bicycles and delivered the message on bicycle or on foot. This is combat. They had to do that. They didn't have a radio for everybody. They didn't have communications for everybody. So how did they get the message across? You know, like I was a signalman, flashing light semaphore, right? Morse code. Would telegraph come back? We might have to do telegraph. I don't know, but these are options. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if the shit really hits the fan, and I hope it doesn't, and I'm thinking it's not going to. I don't think it's going to be that bad, because even the people who might be trying to execute such a plan, they don't want to be stuck in the Stone Ages any more than we do. So, you know, keep our heads screwed on straight. But that's kind of the path that we have to think on. And I think what I'm trying to give you, I hope it gives you some information so you understand more about communications. And by the way, I've been involved in a radio hobby for many, many years, and it wasn't a job for me. It entered into my job. Communications was always there, present as part of my job. But I'm not a technician. You know, I'm a general radio operator, ham radio operator. I have limited repair experience, so I do repair some of my own gear, but it's still limited compared to a real tech who did it for a living. If anybody has any comments to this, drop it in the comments. Let's have a talk about it. Talk to me about it, because you might be able to fill in some blanks, because there is some newer technology that I've seen. Like I've seen these 5G radios that are out there, and I think they work through the internet. I don't know much about it, but see, there was questions even I had about these particular handheld radios. I think they were more like a glorified cell phone, kind of like the days when they mixed the radios in with the cell phone. On the Nextel, where you had a key on the side of the radio and you talked to a talk group. So, but that went through a cell tower, and I think if it's a 5G radio, it's going to need that 5G tower wire system. And if that is not working, we probably won't have it. And I think we're going to be back down to brass tacks where the communication model is concerned. So that's where I'm at. Again, if anybody wants to chime in on this conversation, definitely, throw something in the low bar down there in the chat, and let's talk about it. I'd like to hear what other people are seeing or hearing and what they think. So, all right, thanks. I appreciate it. I didn't mean to take up so much of your time. Take care.